The night settled over the plantation with a weight that seemed almost physical, pressing down on the weathered timbers of the main house and the narrow dirt paths that twisted between the slave quarters and the fields beyond. A low wind carried the scent of decaying leaves and faint smoke from the distant hearths, mingling with something heavier, more insidious, the subtle trace of fear that had taken root here long before the sun disappeared behind the horizon. In one of the dimly lit rooms near the rear of the estate, a young woman sat on a rough wooden stool, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was slender, barely more than a girl in appearance, though the life she had been forced to endure had carved lines of sorrow and vigilance into her face far beyond her years. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the door whenever a shadow moved in the hall, and when she exhaled, it was with a barely audible shiver, as if the very air around her carried threats she had learned to sense but could not name. Outside, the sounds of the plantation seemed ordinary, horses shifting in their stables, the faint clatter of tools, the occasional murmur of voices, but even these familiar noises were laden with tension. Each creak of the floorboards, each sudden rustle of a tree branch, became a possible harbinger of new cruelty. The young woman's life had always been one of observation, of reading the subtle changes in the faces of those around her, anticipating moods and movements with meticulous care. She had long ago learned that attention, not confrontation, was her primary shield. Even the slightest misstep, a delayed reply, a gaze held too long, could invite punishment, humiliation, or worse. And yet, despite the constant vigilance, there was a part of her that could not suppress the rising tide of dread, the sense that the darkness surrounding her was not just the natural shadow of night or the decrepitude of the plantation house, but something far more deliberate, patient, and malignant. It was not only the adults who imposed this atmosphere of fear. The whispers of children, those born into the same oppressive household yet too young to fully understand, carried with them an eerie mimicry of the adult world. They repeated fragments of threats they had overheard, half-formed warnings that seemed to float in the air and settle in the young woman's mind like unwelcome seeds. At times, she would catch their small, pale faces peering around corners, their wide eyes reflecting curiosity, awe, and an instinctive recognition that something in this house was fundamentally wrong. The plantation itself, with its long, shadowed halls, cracked walls, and faded portraits, seemed complicit. Paintings of stern ancestors, eyes dark and unyielding, hung in positions that forced constant surveillance, as if the family's past had been encoded into the very structure of the home, and now demanded obedience through silent intimidation. Even the servants, who moved quietly and with purpose throughout the house, bore expressions that hinted at knowledge too dangerous to speak aloud. Their glances lingered longer than politeness would allow, and in the occasional whispered conversation that ceased abruptly when the young woman approached, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that her life was defined by invisible chains, the weight of generational expectations, and the predatory interest of those who considered her existence both valuable and expendable. It was in these small, almost imperceptible interactions that the first true terror of her reality revealed itself, not through overt violence or spectacle, but through the omnipresence of control, the subtle omnipotence of those who wielded power over her every breath. On the rare occasions when the plantation seemed still, the young woman would retreat to the small corner of her room that felt safest, a narrow strip beside the wall where she could press her back and pretend she was invisible. In those moments, she allowed herself the luxury of imagining escape, of envisioning a world beyond the heavy iron gates and the ever-watchful eyes of the family. But the fantasies were always interrupted, by a sudden sound, a shadow shifting in the hall, or the unmistakable chill of expectation pressing down on her from all directions. It was as though the plantation itself existed not merely as a physical location but as an entity, a living extension of the family's will, attuned to her thoughts, capable of preempting her smallest defiance. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, pale and trembling, the young woman's body bore the fatigue of countless sleepless nights, though her mind remained alert, scanning for the slightest sign of danger. The outside world would not yet witness the horrors she endured, the town beyond the plantation boundaries would remain ignorant, complicit in its oblivion. Yet, in the quiet hours before morning, the whispers of history were already beginning to coalesce, threads of a story that would one day shock and confound those who attempted to recount it. And it was in these fragile, shadowed hours that the first seeds of what would become a harrowing legacy of suffering, resilience, and unspoken horror took root, setting the stage for the extraordinary, tragic journey of a woman caught in a cycle she did not choose, yet was destined to endure. The plantation, though imposing in size, was but one thread in the intricate tapestry of the town that surrounded it, a town that, like its central estate, seemed suspended in a timeless liminality between the remnants of a fractured past and the fragile promise of a changing world. Cobbled streets wound between rows of weathered buildings, some leaning with age, others freshly painted yet hollow of vitality. The townspeople moved through these streets with a kind of practiced neutrality, nodding politely, speaking in measured tones, but beneath the civility lay a network of unspoken rules and buried truths, a delicate lattice of fear, power, and inherited obligation. To outsiders, it might have seemed ordinary, perhaps quaint, but those attuned to the subtler rhythms of the town would have sensed its peculiar pulse, an undercurrent of tension threading every conversation, every glance, every hesitant step along the unlit roads. It was within this fragile equilibrium that the young woman's story became entangled, a narrative that would grow to illuminate the darkest corners of the community's conscience. Her family, wealthy yet insular, wielded influence in ways that were subtle yet absolute. Their authority extended beyond the plantation gates, reaching into town hall deliberations, local religious institutions, and even the whispered judgments of neighbors who had once been friends. A legacy of privilege, entwined with moral compromise, ensured that any transgression, or revelation of hidden suffering, would be met with suppression or deliberate misdirection. The young woman, though seemingly powerless, was the fulcrum around which these forces turned, her existence simultaneously vital and expendable in the eyes of those who claimed stewardship over both her body and her lineage. The town's history was steeped in contradiction. Formerly prosperous in the aftermath of the Civil War, it now bore the dual burden of economic instability and the lingering vestiges of entrenched social hierarchy. Streets that once thrummed with commerce were now lined with shuttered shops and crumbling facades. Wealthy families, including hers, maintained appearances of success, their estates meticulously curated to project authority, but the reality behind the gates was far less orderly. Servants and laborers, whose labor sustained the town's fragile economy, whispered stories of unrecorded injustices, of cruelty hidden behind locked doors and tightly drawn curtains. In these murmurs, the young woman's name appeared intermittently, linked to incidents that the powerful could neither deny nor openly acknowledge, stories that flickered in and out of memory like ghostly shadows dancing at the edge of a candle's glow. Religious devotion served as both balm and constraint, a lens through which morality was interpreted selectively, often to the advantage of those in power. Pulpits and prayer meetings, though outwardly sanctified, functioned as subtle instruments of control. Sermons emphasized obedience, piety, and the maintenance of social order, rarely venturing into the ethical ramifications of private cruelty. The family patriarch's presence in these gatherings was a constant reminder of authority. His measured tone and austere demeanor conveyed a silent assertion of dominance, suggesting that moral transgression, if committed, would be sanctioned only by him, and only in accordance with his interests. The young woman, observing these dynamics from within the household and beyond its gates, gradually internalized the complex interplay of devotion, fear, and expectation, understanding that any appeal to conscience outside the family circle would likely be met with ridicule, disbelief, or punishment. The physical layout of the town itself reinforced the social hierarchies that maintained her entrapment. Narrow lanes channeled movement in predictable ways, gates and fences delineated territory, and unspoken social codes dictated who could be seen and where. In this environment, observation was as powerful as direct action. The eyes of neighbors, servants, and family alike operated as a network of surveillance, a mechanism by which behavior was regulated without overt threat. Even casual visitors could sense the subtle currents of control, the almost imperceptible but pervasive insistence that all individuals understood their place and limitations. Within this lattice, the young woman existed as both participant and spectacle, her every movement observed, catalogued, and, when necessary, corrected. It was in these conditions that early warnings of her extraordinary suffering began to manifest. Minor anomalies, such as the unusual absence of her name from certain public records, the hushed tones of servants who occasionally glimpsed her private moments, or the furtive glances of children who sensed danger they could not articulate, provided the first threads of evidence that would later be pieced together into a coherent, if horrifying, narrative. Each detail, though seemingly inconsequential, reinforced the sense that the town itself was an accomplice, its structures, customs, and collective inattention creating the conditions necessary for prolonged and systematic abuse. The young woman's life, though intimate and personal, was thus inexorably intertwined with the larger social fabric, her suffering magnified by the quiet complicity of the world around her. Families in the town maintained facades of civility, often hosting gatherings and social events where laughter and music masked the undercurrents of fear and secrecy. Guests spoke in careful euphemisms, danced with practiced joy, and raised toasts that concealed anxiety, yet beneath every gesture lay the knowledge that power and propriety were fragile constructs, easily disrupted by revelation. The young woman, observing these gatherings, could discern patterns of behavior, who deferred to authority, who whispered warnings, who avoided particular topics altogether. These observations sharpened her awareness of the precarious balance she navigated daily, teaching her that survival depended not only on caution but on a subtle understanding of human psychology, social expectation, and the invisible mechanisms of control that defined the town's identity. By the time the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the streets and fields, the town's duality was unmistakable. Its beauty and decay, hope and repression, civility and cruelty existed side by side, forming a tableau in which the young woman's story could unfold with tragic inevitability. Each alleyway, each fading facade, and each whispered interaction contributed to an atmosphere of tension that both mirrored and amplified her personal plight. In this environment, she existed at the nexus of past and present, innocence and corruption, visibility and invisibility, setting the stage for the unfolding narrative of suffering, endurance, and the slow, almost imperceptible unraveling of a community's moral fabric. The first indications that something was profoundly amiss in the young woman's life were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. At first, they manifested in quiet moments, an abrupt glance exchanged between servants, a whispered word that fell silent when she approached, or the faint tremor in the voice of a child repeating phrases overheard from the adults around them. These signs, seemingly insignificant in isolation, coalesced into a pattern that hinted at a far darker reality beneath the surface of the town's orderly appearance. The young woman, sensitive to nuance and trained by necessity to observe every gesture, sound, and shadow, began to perceive the contours of a world governed not by justice or compassion, but by secrecy, power, and an unspoken code that demanded her compliance above all else. She noticed the oddities first in the household's daily rhythm. Tasks that should have been routine carried with them an undercurrent of tension, subtle. Interruptions that hinted at a hierarchy both rigid and arbitrary. Meals were served with meticulous precision, yet the young woman often found herself excluded from certain conversations or spaces without explanation. Windows were left open at night to allow an unseasonable draft, or doors were quietly secured in ways that made her movements predictable, constrained, and constantly monitored. Even the furniture and layout of her small quarters seemed designed for surveillance rather than comfort. There was a precision to these arrangements that spoke to the family's awareness of her presence and their desire to manipulate it, a silent assertion of control that left no room for error or deviation. Local lore and whispered warnings from the town's older residents began to seep into her consciousness. She overheard fragments of tales about previous generations of women in her family, stories half-remembered and shrouded in ambiguity, hinting at patterns of exploitation that had persisted over decades. Some accounts were delivered in hushed tones at the edge of her hearing, as if uttering them too loudly might summon retribution. Others came from children, repeating phrases they did not fully understand but which carried a gravity far beyond their age. The juxtaposition of innocence and knowledge created a dissonance that unsettled her deeply. She sensed that her own life was not merely influenced by these histories, but had become a continuation of them, a line of suffering maintained and perpetuated by those who prioritized family legacy, control, and self-interest over compassion or morality. Subtle physical signs began to appear as well. Sleep was fragmented. Her body, conditioned by fear and anticipation, reacted to noises and movements that might otherwise go unnoticed. A creak in the floorboards, a shadow flitting past a window, or the sudden silence of a nearby room could provoke a reaction she could barely control. She noticed that even her own reflection in a mirror seemed altered, as though the eyes that stared back carried the accumulated weight of anxiety and unvoiced dread. These physical and psychological responses reinforced the reality that her environment was not neutral, it was active, coercive, and designed to shape her perception and behavior with relentless subtlety. Interactions with family members were equally fraught with ambiguity. Smiles and gentle words could mask intentions of manipulation, while brief expressions of anger or impatience carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment. The young woman had learned to read these cues with painstaking care, recognizing that the line between protection and control was often indistinguishable. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, existed within a lattice of observation and judgment, and missteps, however minor, could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. In this environment, the smallest anomalies, an unspoken glance, a misaligned gesture, or an inadvertent delay, became amplifiers of anxiety, reinforcing her awareness that she was living under constant, invisible scrutiny. Among the town's servants and observers, subtle signs of concern manifested in indirect warnings. A tray left at her door with extra care, a quiet murmur when she passed through the halls, or the sudden disappearance of a familiar face could all be interpreted as attempts to communicate dangers that could not be spoken aloud. These gestures, though small, were laden with significance, hinting at the breadth and depth of the forces constraining her life. The young woman, ever perceptive, began to catalogue these incidents, mapping them mentally, seeking patterns that might help her anticipate and navigate the dangers surrounding her. Each observation deepened her understanding of the meticulous, almost ritualized systems of control that governed her existence, reinforcing the impression that the plantation, its residents, and even the town itself were all complicit in maintaining her subjugation. The psychological weight of these signs began to manifest in her own behavior. She became cautious, measured, and hyper-aware, internalizing the rhythms of fear that had been imposed upon her. Her thoughts often wandered to hypothetical escapes, imagined interventions, or subtle acts of defiance, only to be tempered by the relentless awareness of the surveillance and judgment that defined her reality. In these moments, a sense of isolation settled over her, a quiet, suffocating loneliness that underscored the impossibility of seeking help or understanding from those around her. Friends, if any existed, were too constrained by social expectation, fear, or complicity to offer genuine support, leaving her to navigate the encroaching darkness on her own. By the time the sun cast long, uneven shadows across the plantation grounds, the young woman had begun to understand the unspoken rules governing her life, that compliance was necessary for survival, that observation was more important than action, and that even the smallest anomalies could presage larger dangers. The accumulation of these subtle warnings, each individually minor but collectively overwhelming, created a psychological landscape as treacherous as the physical one she traversed daily. It was a world in which innocence clashed with malevolence, perception collided with manipulation, and the line between reality and anticipation blurred until fear itself became a constant companion. The early signs of unease were not dramatic or overt. There were no singular events that could be catalogued as decisive turning points. Rather, they were cumulative, like drops of water carving a channel through stone, shaping her consciousness and resilience, laying the groundwork for the trials and horrors that would define her life. They were the quiet tremors before an earthquake, subtle yet insistent, hinting at the broader collapse of moral and social order that would inevitably follow. In recognizing these signs, the young woman was already engaging in a form of survival, attuning herself to the rhythms of fear, secrecy, and control that would dominate the narrative to come, ensuring that she was prepared, even if only marginally, for the unfolding horrors that history would later record in fragmented whispers, rumors, and silences. As the young woman navigated the rigid confines of her world, fragments of her reality began to emerge through the testimonies of those who had glimpsed her suffering, either directly or indirectly. These witnesses were few, and their recollections were tinged with fear, hesitation, and, in some cases, guilt. Many had chosen silence for years, complicit in the quiet enforcement of the family's authority, yet memory has a way of surfacing when least expected. Their accounts did not provide clarity in the conventional sense, rather, they offered glimpses, fragmented shards of perception that, when combined, painted an unsettling and increasingly complex portrait of the young woman's existence. It was through these delicate, almost spectral narratives that the contours of her tragedy began to crystallize, each voice adding depth, contradiction, and nuance to the larger story. One such witness was an elderly servant, whose tenure at the plantation spanned decades. She remembered the young woman as a child of remarkable gentleness and cautious intelligence, her presence at once unassuming and quietly observant. Yet, even in these early years, the servant had noted the ways in which she was singled out for attention that was both protective and threatening. The matriarch and patriarch of the family observed her with an intensity that went beyond conventional guardianship, a constant weighing of her compliance, her obedience, and, most disturbingly, her potential to disrupt the order of the household. The servant's recollections were delivered with pauses, as if the act of remembering reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Each sentence carried the weight of years of unspoken truths, the careful avoidance of which had been necessary for her own survival. Another witness came from outside the immediate household, a neighboring shopkeeper whose window overlooked the rear garden of the estate. He recalled observing the young woman during rare moments of outdoor labor, noting how she moved with careful precision, avoiding sudden gestures, her eyes continually scanning the environment. He described how the family's children, playing nearby, would sometimes pause, staring at her with expressions that suggested both fear and recognition of unspoken rules. From his vantage point, it was clear that she was not merely a member of the household, but a figure marked by circumstance and control, her life choreographed by forces invisible to most observers. His testimony was hesitant, as if recalling the scene too vividly risked stirring memories the mind instinctively wished to suppress, but it conveyed a sense of quiet horror that was impossible to ignore. Among the town's clergy, another perspective emerged, equally fragmented but no less telling. A visiting minister recalled noticing the young woman during a Sunday service, seated near the back of the church, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly as though bracing herself against an unseen weight. The minister could not have known the precise nature of her suffering, yet there was a palpable aura of tension surrounding her, a subtle but undeniable signal that her internal life was burdened in ways few could comprehend. Parishioners glanced at her occasionally, their expressions neutral or polite, yet the minister later speculated that many had observed and ignored, participating unconsciously in a culture of silent oversight that allowed fear and control to flourish. His account, reconstructed from notes taken decades later, spoke to the systemic nature of her predicament, the manner in which ordinary observation, gossip, avoidance, casual interest, combined to sustain the invisible mechanisms of subjugation. Whispers also reached the ears of the town's youth, who often repeated what they heard in fragmented and distorted forms. Children, less constrained by propriety but equally attuned to social hierarchies, began mimicking adult behaviors, sometimes relaying partial observations to peers. One recalled glimpsing the young woman as she was guided through the household corridors by an elder relative, her expression one of quiet resignation, her movements measured, almost rehearsed. These observations, though filtered through the lens of childlike interpretation, added layers of complexity to the narrative. They reflected not only what was visible but how perception, misinterpretation, and rumor could perpetuate an understanding of suffering that was both accurate and deeply flawed, a mosaic of partial truths forming the foundation of legend long before formal record. Each witness added contradictions as well as confirmation. Some noted the young woman's rare flashes of defiance, a lingering glance at the family patriarch, a subtle shift in stance when confronted, or a whispered refusal that went unheard by most. Others recalled her submissiveness, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the meticulous adherence to prescribed behaviors. The interplay of these observations underscored the duality of her existence, an outward compliance masking an internal struggle, a life defined simultaneously by invisibility and the absolute centrality of her position within the household's hierarchy. For those recalling these moments years later, the tension remained palpable, the memory of her suffering, though partially obscured by time, retained a capacity to unsettle and provoke reflection on complicity, morality, and power. As these accounts surfaced, a pattern emerged, not in terms of linear chronology but in the atmospheric consistency of dread and control. Witnesses independently highlighted the precision with which the family exerted authority, the omnipresence of observation, and the subtle mechanisms through which obedience was demanded. The young woman's psychological and emotional state, inferred from these recollections, was characterized by vigilance, suppression of fear, and an acute awareness of the consequences of misstep. Even when incidents seemed mundane or innocuous, passing through a hallway, performing a household chore, interacting with a distant relative, they were filtered through an invisible lens of surveillance and judgment, contributing to the slow accumulation of trauma that would define her story. The witnesses themselves experienced their own forms of moral conflict. Some, haunted by guilt, confessed to small acts of complicity, noting times when they had chosen silence or indirect participation over intervention. Others, unable to articulate direct knowledge of wrongdoing, nevertheless described a persistent unease, a sense that the young woman's life was governed by forces beyond comprehension, yet unmistakably cruel. The interplay of denial, observation, and partial acknowledgement created a landscape in which truth was both present and obscured, a reflection of the broader societal dynamics at play, a town unwilling or unable to confront the uncomfortable realities festering within its heart. Through these early witness accounts, the story of the young woman's life began to take shape in the historical record, not as a singular event but as a constellation of moments, observations, and interpretations. Each fragment of memory, whether whispered, recorded, or partially forgotten, contributed to an intricate narrative of oppression, resilience, and the enduring complexity of human behavior. The audience, guided by these multiple perspectives, is invited to navigate the ambiguity, piecing together evidence while remaining aware of its limitations. The cumulative effect is one of tension and anticipation, a slow unveiling of horror mediated by the eyes of those who dared to remember, setting the stage for the deeper conflicts and escalating tragedy to come. In the town surrounding the plantation, appearances mattered more than reality, and propriety often functioned as a shield against scrutiny. While whispers occasionally surfaced, fragments of gossip, fleeting looks, or cryptic comments, they were quickly suppressed, either by the weight of social expectation or the deliberate intervention of those in positions of authority. Religious leaders, magistrates, and the influential family members who dominated civic life worked together, whether consciously or unconsciously, to maintain the illusion of normalcy. This collective denial did not merely protect the powerful, it was a mechanism that insulated the entire community from confronting truths too dark to acknowledge openly. For the young woman at the center of this hidden world, this denial was both a curse and a form of containment, shaping every choice, every interaction, and every breath she drew. Church, the heart of the town's social and moral structure, became a key instrument in this subtle enforcement. Sermons emphasized obedience, humility, and the inherent order of creation, suggesting that suffering could be justified or divinely sanctioned if interpreted correctly. Parishioners internalized these teachings, and the young woman learned to move quietly through this moral landscape, understanding that the eyes of others were always present, even when unseen. The ministers themselves, perhaps aware of the whispers circulating within the congregation, rarely intervened in ways that might disrupt the social hierarchy. Their silence, whether born of fear, indifference, or complicity, reinforced the oppressive structures that governed her life. In this environment, moral clarity was elusive, obscured by layers of tradition, social expectation, and the careful choreography of appearances. Local authorities, too, played a role in this web of concealment. Town records, ostensibly factual, often contained omissions or euphemistic language that disguised the true nature of events. Reports of accidents, disputes, or unexplained absences were framed in a way that deflected suspicion, maintained order, and preserved the reputations of those in power. Even those charged with maintaining law and order were hesitant to probe deeply. The consequences of uncovering inconvenient truths were unpredictable and socially disruptive. For the young woman, the structural invisibility of these protections meant that formal recourse was almost impossible. The machinery of civic oversight, rather than serving as a safeguard, functioned as a veil, thin in appearance, yet dense and impenetrable in its effects. Beyond the institutions of church and town hall, the family itself carefully orchestrated a culture of control. The patriarch and matriarch exercised authority with an almost ritualistic precision, employing subtle psychological pressures, silent surveillance, and occasional overt reprimands to maintain dominance. Guests at social events, visitors from neighboring estates, and even distant relatives were encouraged, knowingly or not, to participate in this charade. Conversations were guided away from uncomfortable topics, eyes were diverted from awkward situations, and any hint of recognition of the young woman's suffering was quickly extinguished. In this way, the household functioned as both theater and prison, each participant performing a role that reinforced the dominant narrative, while the young woman remained the central, silent witness to her own subjugation. The townspeople themselves, bound by a combination of fear, habit, and social inertia, contributed to the persistence of denial. Ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, neighbors, and laborers, were acutely aware of the subtle signals that indicated danger, yet few felt empowered to intervene. To challenge the family or expose wrongdoing risked social ostracism, economic reprisal, or physical harm. The collective consciousness of the town had been shaped to prioritize survival and conformity over moral clarity, resulting in a culture in which suffering could persist largely unchecked. The young woman's presence, her quiet movements and careful compliance, became both a signal and a mirror, reflecting the town's unwillingness to acknowledge its own complicity. Amid this atmosphere of suppression, the young woman's internal life grew increasingly complex. She learned to parse the silent language of the town, the subtle shifts in tone, the avoidance of certain subjects, the hesitation in glances, the weight of pauses between words. These unspoken cues became vital tools of navigation, guiding her in spaces where direct confrontation was impossible. Even in moments of apparent tranquility, the presence of veiled observation and passive enforcement reminded her that freedom of thought and expression was a luxury she could not afford. Her world had become a delicate dance of perception, anticipation, and careful performance, each misstep carrying potential consequences that extended beyond her immediate understanding. Religious and social rituals, designed to maintain order and project propriety, took on a double-edged quality. On one hand, they offered a predictable structure, a rhythm by which behavior could be regulated and fear managed. On the other, they served as constant reminders of surveillance and control, reinforcing the notion that her existence was continually measured against an invisible standard of expectation. Even acts as simple as attending church, greeting visitors, or performing domestic duties were imbued with heightened significance. Each action was scrutinized, each response evaluated, and each deviation from prescribed behavior noted, whether consciously or subconsciously, by those around her. The young woman's interactions with servants and staff further illustrated the pervasiveness of this veil of denial. Some offered small, almost imperceptible gestures of empathy, an extra blanket left folded, a sympathetic glance, a quiet warning, while others reinforced the structure of control either through adherence to orders or the silent complicity demanded by fear. These micro-interactions created a network of observation and influence that was both invisible and inescapable, shaping her experience in ways that were subtle yet profoundly consequential. She learned to interpret these cues, weighing intentions, discerning loyalty, and navigating the fraught moral landscape that defined her existence. Through it all, the town's collective denial functioned as a powerful, almost organic force. It was neither a single conspiratorial act nor a coordinated effort, but rather the accumulation of countless small choices, gestures, and silences that collectively sustained a structure of oppression. Within this framework, the young woman's life unfolded, each day a testament to resilience and survival under conditions carefully masked by civility. The result was a tension that permeated every aspect of her world, a slow-burning suspense created not by dramatic spectacle, but by the quiet, unyielding weight of institutional, social, and familial denial. By the time evening fell over the town, casting long shadows across streets and plantations alike, the young woman had internalized the lesson that truth could be obscured, suffering could be tolerated, and appearances could be weaponized. The community's veil of denial, though subtle, was absolute in its effects, creating an environment in which horror could flourish invisibly, yet with the inevitability of gravity. It was within this shadowed, morally ambiguous landscape that her story would continue to unfold, escalating in psychological intensity and narrative complexity, as the forces of suppression, fear, and social expectation converged around her, shaping both her experience and the collective memory of the town itself. The oppressive rhythms of the plantation and the town's unspoken complicity began to exact a toll on the young woman that was subtle at first, then gradually inescapable. Each day, the weight of observation pressed upon her mind, a persistent reminder that every movement, every word, every thought might be noted and judged. Sleep became fragmented, haunted by the echoes of whispered instructions, shadowed glances, and the ever-present sense that her autonomy was a fragile illusion. She awoke to the same corridors, the same rooms, the same silent hierarchy, and each repetition reinforced the boundaries of her captivity, deepening the sense that her mind itself was no longer entirely her own. The psychological decay was insidious. At first, it manifested as hypervigilance, a meticulous attention to sound, posture, and expression. She learned to predict the moods of those around her with near-perfect accuracy, anticipating reprimand, manipulation, or subtle shifts in control. Her body reacted instinctively. A sudden tremor in a footstep, a creak in the hallway, or a shift in lighting could provoke anxiety so immediate and intense it left her paralyzed for moments. These reactions, though seemingly minor, reinforced a growing internal tension, a constant state of alertness that left little room for thought, reflection, or reprieve. In the absence of open confrontation, fear became both her teacher and her prison. With time, the young woman's inner world began to fracture. Small moments of clarity were increasingly interrupted by intrusive thoughts, fleeting imaginations of escape, and a pervasive sense of unreality. The juxtaposition of her outward compliance with her inward awareness created a tension that gnawed at her sanity. She began to observe herself as though from a distance, cataloging her own behaviors, noting her own hesitation, and questioning her reactions. This self-monitoring, born of necessity, became a mirror of isolation. She was never alone, yet never truly seen or understood. The very act of survival required a division of self, a compartmentalization of identity that blurred the line between conscious agency and conditioned response. The people surrounding her, whether family members, servants, or townspeople, played roles that intensified her psychological burden. Their behavior oscillated unpredictably between warmth and cruelty, attention and neglect, making it impossible to form reliable expectations. One moment, a caretaker might offer a gesture of kindness, a soft word, a prepared meal, a fleeting look of concern, only for that moment to be immediately followed by strict rebuke or enforced compliance. These oscillations created a landscape of emotional whiplash, where her mental and emotional state was constantly tested, eroding the sense of safety, stability, and personal identity. She learned that attachment itself was dangerous, that trust was provisional, and that even the smallest misjudgment could reverberate through her life with lasting consequences. Isolation, both physical and emotional, became a defining feature of her experience. Even in rooms crowded with family members or servants, she felt a profound aloneness, as if a transparent barrier separated her from those around her. Communication, when possible, was filtered through caution, masking thoughts and intentions to avoid misinterpretation. Silence became both a shield and a symptom. By speaking less, she preserved her safety, but in doing so, she reinforced the separation between herself and the world. The tension of this isolation intensified her sensitivity to the faintest signals of danger or observation. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle shift in tone was magnified, contributing to a heightened state of anxiety and reinforcing the psychological cage in which she lived. Over time, the young woman's body began to bear the strain of her mental turmoil. Her posture grew rigid, movements deliberate, and gestures calculated to minimize attention. Nervous tics emerged, small signs of the persistent stress that coursed through her daily existence. Her reflection, once a mirror of youth and vitality, now presented a figure both vigilant and haunted. She began to recognize the marks of prolonged fear in herself, dark circles under the eyes, a tension in the shoulders, and a quiet but persistent fatigue that no rest could fully alleviate. These physical manifestations reinforced the psychological ones, creating a feedback loop in which the body and mind were caught in an unrelenting spiral of vigilance, anxiety, and suppressed dread. Even her interactions with the natural world were colored by this psychological burden. A sudden rustle in the trees, a breeze brushing against the walls of the house, or the distant sound of horses on the road could trigger heightened awareness, recalling the ever-present eyes of those who watched, the invisible pressures that dictated her every action. Nature, which might have provided solace to others, became an extension of the surveillance and control that dominated her existence. The boundary between external threat and internal response blurred, and the young woman increasingly interpreted ordinary occurrences through the lens of fear and anticipation. The slow accumulation of psychological stress created an internal narrative dominated by anticipation and anxiety. She began to imagine worst-case scenarios, rehearsing potential dangers and outcomes in meticulous mental detail. These mental exercises, though adaptive in the sense of preparation, further entrenched a sense of perpetual threat. Even moments of temporary relief were shadowed by the expectation that vigilance could never cease. In these ways, her internal life became a battlefield, a constant negotiation between resilience and despair, observation and instinct, compliance and the faint stirrings of defiance. By the time evening descended over the plantation, the young woman's psychological state had become a complex mosaic of fear, awareness, and fragile self-preservation. The corridors she navigated were not merely physical spaces but embodiments of authority, surveillance, and expectation. The shadows along the walls, the dim light from flickering lamps, and the quiet murmurs of the household all served as reminders that her autonomy was constrained, that her inner life was under siege, and that every day was a negotiation of control and endurance. In this crucible of fear and observation, the first deep fissures of psychological trauma formed, setting the stage for further escalation of tension, conflict, and the eventual unraveling of both personal and communal facades. As the young woman's suffering became increasingly visible, though never fully acknowledged, the town and its surrounding intellectual circles sought to rationalize the events they could observe yet neither comprehend nor openly confront. Attempts at explanation emerged from multiple, often conflicting perspectives: scientific speculation, folkloric interpretation, and the half-formed theories of those whose curiosity was constrained by morality, fear, or limited knowledge. Each attempt at understanding reflected more about the observers than the reality they sought to decipher, yet together they formed a lattice of interpretation that would shape historical memory and deepen the mystique surrounding her life. Medical practitioners, limited by the understanding of their era, approached her condition with a mixture of curiosity and procedural detachment. Some examined her for physical signs of illness, fatigue, or psychological strain, seeking tangible explanations for what seemed an extraordinary level of endurance under relentless stress. They noted anomalies, paleness, irregular pulse, signs of malnutrition, and speculated on nervous disorders, hysteria, or other conditions recognized within the constraints of 19th-century medicine. Their reports, often clinical and devoid of empathy, documented the physical and behavioral markers of her situation without fully grasping the social and psychological pressures that produced them. In some cases, the practitioner's inability to provide satisfactory explanations only heightened the sense of incomprehensibility, transforming observation into silent fascination or veiled horror. Folkloric interpretations existed alongside these scientific inquiries, colored by the town's collective imagination, superstition, and the stories whispered across generations. Elders spoke of curses, ancestral sins, or divine punishment, framing her suffering as the inevitable result of some moral imbalance. Tales circulated in hushed voices, accounts of families haunted by unbroken patterns, spirits of wronged women lingering to exact justice, or ominous omens tied to births and deaths. These stories, though often inconsistent and fragmentary, provided a language for explaining what rational observation could not. They served simultaneously as cautionary tales, entertainment, and a social mechanism for enforcing compliance, reinforcing the perception that extraordinary suffering was not only possible but somehow justified or fated. Clerical authorities, grappling with these rumors and observations, offered interpretations grounded in moral and religious frameworks. They spoke of trials of faith, tests of virtue, or the subtle workings of divine will. Sermons and private counsel emphasized endurance, humility, and the mysterious ways in which human suffering intersected with divine purpose. The young woman's plight, in this context, was neither ignored nor addressed with practical intervention, rather, it was contextualized as an inevitable part of a moral and cosmic order that the congregation was ill-equipped to challenge. In this environment, her experiences were obscured by moralizing language, leaving the truth at once present and deliberately concealed. Despite these attempts at rationalization, contradictions abounded. Scientific assessments failed to reconcile behavioral and physiological anomalies, folklore often conflicted with observable reality, and moral interpretations offered neither comfort nor clarity. The town's educated elite, often relying on limited empirical observation combined with personal bias, sometimes produced elaborate theories to reconcile these inconsistencies. These included conjectures about inherited weaknesses, psychological frailty, or the impact of isolated upbringing under strict domestic regimes. Each theory, while seemingly plausible within its own framework, fell short of accounting for the full range of her experiences, leaving observers with partial answers and lingering unease. Rumors of misconduct circulated in more clandestine circles, whispered by those too cautious to speak openly but too disturbed to remain silent. Some speculated that her family's strict control extended beyond conventional boundaries, encompassing aspects of her life that were socially and legally taboo. These whispered accounts often conflicted with more official explanations, creating a cognitive dissonance that both fascinated and unsettled those who attempted to parse the facts. The very act of attempting to understand her situation highlighted the limitations of observation and reasoning in the face of entrenched secrecy and deliberate concealment. In the private sphere of letters, journals, and personal notes, a different pattern emerged. Writers and observers, attempting to reconcile their personal observations with broader social constraints, often oscillated between empathy, fascination, and self-protective rationalization. Some documented signs of psychological trauma or distress with careful neutrality, noting unusual behaviors, moments of fear, or fleeting expressions of resistance. Others expressed guilt for their failure to intervene, writing of tension between moral awareness and social compliance. These personal records, often hidden or unpublished, would later provide historians with crucial insights into the complex interplay of human observation, moral judgment, and social restraint. Even within the town's intellectual salons, speculation took the form of theoretical debate. Educated men and women, influenced by contemporary literature, emerging scientific thought, and prevailing moral philosophies, debated the causes of her suffering in terms that combined observation, conjecture, and social prejudice. These discussions ranged from physiological explanations, including extreme nervous sensitivity or inherited predispositions, to social and moral accounts, positing that her environment and family structure were both cause and perpetuator of distress. Each theory, no matter how carefully formulated, failed to penetrate the deeper truths of her lived experience, yet contributed to the aura of mystery that surrounded her existence. In many ways, the multiplicity of explanations only intensified the town's obsession with order and understanding. The inability to reconcile observation with lived reality created a psychological tension among those who watched and speculated, reinforcing a culture in which appearances, propriety, and selective attention were paramount. The young woman, acutely aware of the scrutiny, became a focal point for these investigations, analyses, and conversations, her very presence an enduring challenge to conventional comprehension. The ambiguity of her experience transformed her into both subject and symbol, a nexus where human curiosity, fear, and moral negotiation intersected. By the close of this period of observation and speculation, it was clear that no single framework, scientific, folkloric, or moral, was sufficient to explain the entirety of her situation. Each partial explanation added layers to the narrative, deepening the sense of mystery while highlighting the limitations of human understanding. The young woman's existence, observed, theorized about, and quietly documented, became an enigma, a case study in the interplay between secrecy, power, and perception. These attempts at explanation, while failing to provide closure, served to heighten suspense and anticipation, preparing the stage for the further unraveling of her life, the eventual collapse of her controlled environment, and the enduring questions that would linger long after the events themselves had faded into history. The fragile equilibrium that had governed the young woman's life began to erode with subtle inevitability, each day adding to the cumulative pressure until the invisible scaffolding of her world creaked under its own weight. What had been routine surveillance, quiet manipulation, and societal complicity gradually transformed into a pervasive, almost tangible suffocation. Walls that once seemed protective now appeared as barriers, familiar rooms became corridors of control and confinement. The small freedoms she had carved for herself, gestures of minor defiance or personal expression, were either observed and corrected or extinguished altogether. In this environment, isolation did not arrive suddenly, it seeped in, an inexorable presence that claimed both space and spirit. The psychological toll of relentless observation began to manifest as a profound disconnection from reality. The young woman's interactions with her family, servants, and neighbors were increasingly marked by a kind of spectral detachment. Words spoken to her seemed distant, almost as if filtered through a veil of anxiety and anticipation. Gestures, smiles, and admonishments alike carried double meanings, their significance amplified by her heightened awareness of potential consequences. Each social encounter became a performance in which she meticulously calibrated every expression, every movement, every word. Even the most mundane interactions, passing through a corridor, offering a polite nod, or receiving instructions, required careful negotiation between compliance, self-preservation, and the faintest expression of agency. Physical confinement mirrored this psychological isolation. The plantation itself, sprawling and imposing, had become a carefully controlled environment. Gates, doors, and pathways were arranged to allow close monitoring of her movements, and even open spaces such as gardens or courtyards were patrolled with subtle attentiveness. The boundaries of her world, once generous in appearance, now defined the contours of a tightly managed existence, each square foot reinforcing her status as observed, contained, and constrained. In moments of solitude, the very expansiveness of the estate emphasized her confinement, the spaces around her serving as constant reminders that autonomy was provisional, fleeting, and ultimately denied. Her relationship with the household staff further deepened the sense of collapse. Some were complicit in subtle forms of reinforcement, ensuring that expectations were met and deviations corrected. Others offered fleeting glimmers of empathy, extra blankets, whispered warnings, or furtive gestures of encouragement, but these were fragile, insufficient to counteract the overwhelming structure of control. The young woman learned to navigate these interactions with precision, reading each subtle signal for potential danger, while simultaneously yearning for connection that could not be safely expressed. This intricate social calculus, necessary for survival, intensified her isolation, reinforcing the perception that the world outside her mind was not a sanctuary but a theater of observation and judgment. As isolation intensified, the young woman's inner life became both refuge and prison. She withdrew into mental landscapes of memory, imagination, and cautious speculation, creating a private world in which she could exercise limited control. In these moments, she rehearsed conversations, anticipated responses, and constructed scenarios in which freedom might be attainable. Yet the act of imagination, though sustaining, also reinforced her awareness of limitation. Every flight of fancy was constrained by reality, every plan shadowed by the omnipresence of authority, surveillance, and expectation. Her mind, while resilient, became a battlefield, oscillating between hope and despair, agency and entrapment, reality and the imagined. The town itself participated in this collapse. Rumors, fragmented observations, and selective attentiveness created an atmosphere in which she was simultaneously visible and invisible, central yet peripheral. Passers-by offered polite acknowledgement while withholding recognition, their eyes avoiding questions they dared not ask aloud. Clergy spoke in abstract moral terms, reinforcing compliance without intervention. Town officials, 2. Maintained distance, their oversight functional yet indifferent, leaving her to navigate a network of observation, rumor, and social expectation without guidance or reprieve. The young woman existed in a liminal space, a nexus of visibility and suppression, constantly negotiating the tension between being seen and being free. Even the rhythms of daily life contributed to her sense of unraveling. Meals, chores, religious observances, and social interactions were no longer mere routines, each carried potential danger, each required calculation, each became a test of endurance. The cumulative effect of this hypervigilance was profound fatigue, physical, emotional, and psychological. Her body bore the strain in small but persistent ways, a tightening of muscles, the constant bracing against imagined or anticipated reprimand, and the erosion of sleep that allowed fear and reflection to dominate the hours when rest should have come. The collapse was not a dramatic singular event, it was a slow erosion, each day shaving away resilience and shaping a life defined by constraint, observation, and enforced caution. Attempts at resistance, whether subtle or imagined, were invariably curtailed by the meticulous attention of those around her. Moments of defiance, lingering too long in a room, speaking too freely, showing subtle hesitation, were corrected immediately, either through reprimand, subtle gestures, or the silent enforcement of expectation. The cumulative effect of this constant correction was internalized vigilance, a psychological armor that allowed survival but deepened isolation. She learned to anticipate, to predict, to modify herself preemptively, yet this very skill highlighted the impossibility of true freedom. Her mind and body, trained to respond to a web of observation and expectation, became instruments of their own containment. As the seasons shifted, so too did the intensity of her isolation. The passing of time offered no relief, rather, it reinforced the constancy of surveillance, the persistence of expectation, and the inevitability of constraint. Social interactions continued to function as subtle reminders of her entrapment, and even moments of potential camaraderie were fraught with risk. The young woman became increasingly attuned to nuance, the subtlest hesitation in a glance, the faintest change in tone, the smallest deviation from ritualized behavior, each serving as evidence of both danger and oversight. The very act of living, performing daily tasks, and interacting with others became a negotiation between visibility and invisibility, compliance and survival. By the time darkness fell across the plantation and the town beyond, the young woman's collapse was evident in both her outward demeanor and inner landscape. The psychological, emotional, and social pressures converged into a state of heightened vulnerability, in which every interaction was fraught, every space charged, and every moment pregnant with the weight of anticipation. Her isolation was no longer merely physical, it had become structural, psychological, and existential, shaping perception, decision-making, and the faintest aspirations for freedom. Within this matrix of surveillance, suppression, and invisible coercion, the next phase of her story, the slow unspooling of events leading toward irrevocable change, was set to unfold, bringing the private horrors of her life into increasingly stark and inescapable relief. The events that had defined the young woman's life, years of enforced compliance, psychological torment, and social surveillance, left behind a landscape of silence that spoke louder than words ever could. Following the most intense periods of scrutiny and collapse, the town seemed to collectively avert its gaze. Conversations avoided her name, and even casual mention of the household or family circumscribed the edges of memory, leaving only fragments that circulated in hushed tones. This silence was not merely neglect, it was a deliberate mechanism, a societal decision to obscure, rationalize, and ultimately bury the uncomfortable truths that her life had revealed. The absence of acknowledgement became a new form of control, extending the reach of oppression into the realm of memory itself. Neighbors and townspeople, who had once participated in subtle observation and indirect complicity, now enforced silence through omission. The family, conscious of appearances, ensured that her presence was minimized in social gatherings, that visitors were instructed in subtle ways to avoid inquiry, and that even casual acquaintances left conversations with partial understanding at best. Letters, diaries, and local records reflected this trend, with references to her existence often ambiguous, indirect, or euphemistic. The deliberate obfuscation ensured that her suffering remained unexamined by broader audiences, both contemporaneous and future, leaving her story suspended in a space between recorded history and rumor. Servants and household staff, who had been observers and sometimes reluctant participants, also maintained a cautious silence. Memories of her endurance, psychological collapse, and the nuanced dynamics of the household were recounted privately only in whispered confidences. Over time, these recollections were filtered, softened, and partially forgotten, leaving behind partial truths intertwined with conjecture and personal interpretation. The young woman's experiences were transformed into a network of narrative fragments, half-remembered gestures, fleeting expressions, and moments of tension, that could neither fully convey the horror nor provide complete clarity. The effect was an eerie resonance. Her story persisted, yet remained inaccessible, a haunting presence felt more than fully known. Within the town, a pattern emerged in which her story was both present and absent. Children heard fragments of tales filtered through older generations, yet often misunderstood or misremembered key details. Folklore grew around her existence, embedding her life within a moralized framework that emphasized endurance, fate, and divine sanction rather than the coercive human mechanisms that had produced her suffering. Religious authorities, who had once interpreted her life as a trial of virtue or divine testing, now reinforced silence by framing her absence from public discourse as a matter of propriety, further cementing the collective amnesia. In this way, the aftermath became not only an absence of action but an active shaping of memory, transforming lived experience into legend. The young woman herself, constrained by both physical circumstance and societal expectation, internalized this silence. Any attempts to recount her experiences were met with subtle discouragement, disbelief, or avoidance, teaching her that memory, speech, and acknowledgement could be dangerous tools. Over time, she developed a complex relationship with her own narrative, discerning what could be expressed, what could be recorded, and what must remain unspoken. This internalized censorship became both protective and isolating, a mechanism for survival that simultaneously reinforced the barriers between herself and the world. The consequences of speaking, whether in partial truth or full confession, were understood implicitly. Exposure risked retribution, judgment, or renewed cycles of control. The town's response, or lack thereof, reflected broader societal patterns. The social structures that had facilitated her suffering, religious authority, patriarchal hierarchy, economic dependency, and communal observation, remained intact. Her endurance, the collapse of her autonomy, and the psychological weight she bore were acknowledged only indirectly through rumor, partial records, and occasional moralized interpretation. This enforced invisibility transformed the young woman into both a symbol and a cipher. She existed in the consciousness of the town without ever fully entering the communal narrative. The silence surrounding her became a tool of preservation, allowing the town to continue functioning without confronting the moral contradictions her life exposed. Even historians and later observers encountered this silence. When piecing together events from diaries, letters, and partial testimonies, gaps were evident. Dates were uncertain, relationships obscured, and actions left open to interpretation. What could be reconstructed suggested a narrative of suffering, endurance, and control, yet the story's completeness remained forever beyond reach. This absence created a haunting quality to her memory. She was known through what could be observed, inferred, or imagined, yet the full contours of her existence were inaccessible. Her life became a puzzle, its pieces scattered across fragmented accounts, each one hinting at truth while concealing others. In some cases, the local silence perpetuated a subtle legacy of fear and expectation. Future generations, aware of the family's influence and the persistence of societal norms, absorbed a cautious respect, even apprehension, for the patterns established in the past. The young woman's life, though absent from formal records, continued to influence behavior, morality, and communal perception in indirect ways. Children learned through observation and tacit instruction, adults reinforced patterns of compliance, and the moral weight of unspoken knowledge settled over the town like a shadow. Her story became embedded in the social fabric, present as a cautionary specter, yet never fully articulated. Ultimately, the aftermath of her life was defined by tension between presence and absence, acknowledgement and erasure. While her suffering had been endured in visibility, its consequences were absorbed through invisibility. The community, whether consciously or unconsciously, ensured that the most difficult truths were filtered, softened, or forgotten, leaving the young woman both remembered and obscured. In this liminal space, her life continued to exert influence, shaping memory, morality, and imagination while resisting full comprehension. Her existence became a paradox, a testament to resilience, a record of oppression, and a persistent enigma whose echoes would continue to haunt both the town and those who later sought to reconstruct her story. By the end of this period, the young woman had become a figure defined as much by silence as by experience. The town's deliberate inattention, the obfuscation of records, and the moralized filtering of oral history created an environment in which she was both central and absent. The aftermath was not marked by dramatic events or resolution but by a pervasive stillness, a quiet reverberation of consequences that left traces of trauma, observation, and unspoken truths. In this silence, the audience is confronted with the unsettling realization that suffering can persist not only through direct action but through omission, avoidance, and the subtle mechanics of social memory. Even decades after the young woman's life had been constrained, monitored, and partially erased from public discourse, her story continued to provoke speculation, interpretation, and unease. Historians, folklorists, and those drawn to the macabre began to sift through the fragments of memory, diaries, letters, and local oral accounts, searching for patterns, motives, and explanations. Yet the more they uncovered, the more the story resisted definitive conclusions. Her existence became a nexus of unanswered questions, where observation collided with inference, moral interpretation conflicted with historical evidence, and human curiosity sought clarity in a landscape of ambiguity. One school of thought emphasized psychological determinism, positing that the young woman's suffering, endurance, and eventual psychological collapse could be understood through the lens of her environment, upbringing, and social isolation. Scholars argued that the cumulative pressures of observation, suppression, and familial control created a form of learned submission, compounded by the town's complicity. They cited evidence of hypervigilance, fragmented sleep, and withdrawal from social interaction as hallmarks of prolonged psychological stress. From this perspective, her life was a tragic but ultimately explicable example of human adaptation to relentless oppression, a study in endurance and resilience in the face of structurally imposed terror. Another interpretation framed her experience within broader societal structures, emphasizing the intersection of race, class, gender, and social hierarchy. Observers noted that her subjugation was not merely personal but emblematic of a system designed to enforce compliance and maintain authority. The family's control over her movements, choices, and interactions reflected societal patterns that extended far beyond the plantation walls. Religious, economic, and civic institutions reinforced these dynamics, creating a self-perpetuating environment in which oppression was normalized and invisible. From this perspective, the young woman's suffering was inseparable from the structural inequalities that dictated the lives of countless others, making her story both particular and universal, a microcosm of broader historical forces. Folklore and legend offered a different, more spectral interpretation. Tales of curses, ancestral punishment, and divine retribution circulated in hushed voices, suggesting that her life had been shaped by forces beyond human understanding. These stories, transmitted across generations, often blurred the lines between history and myth, fact and imagination. Observers speculated that the trauma she endured left lingering echoes not only in memory but in the moral consciousness of the town. Her endurance, interpreted through the lens of myth, became a symbol of human vulnerability and resilience, a reminder that suffering and injustice leave impressions that ripple across time and space. In this framework, her life was less about concrete events than about the enduring psychological and social imprint she left behind. Scientific attempts to explain her experiences continued alongside these interpretations. Modern psychologists, historians, and sociologists have examined the fragments of evidence with the benefit of contemporary theory, considering diagnoses such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, and complex trauma. They have analyzed the cumulative effects of hypervigilance, forced compliance, and environmental control on her mental and physical well-being. These analyses, while informed by empirical study, still face limitations: the absence of direct testimony, the partial nature of historical records, and the deliberate silences imposed by the community obscure definitive conclusions. The more these modern observers investigate, the more the story remains a tantalizing puzzle, resisting closure even under the scrutiny of contemporary methodology. Moral interpretations continue to add nuance to the discussion. Some view her life as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the ethical obligations of witnesses, the dangers of passive complicity, and the corrosive effects of social hierarchy and moral indifference. Others see her endurance as a testament to human resilience, a demonstration that even in extreme oppression, the mind can preserve fragments of agency, imagination, and hope. These ethical readings intersect with historical and psychological analysis, creating a complex web of interpretation in which no single perspective fully accounts for her life or the forces that shaped it. The lingering questions are as compelling as any attempt at explanation. What might have occurred had her story been confronted openly? How did the silent complicity of neighbors, servants, and religious authorities influence the trajectory of her life? Could she have escaped, or was her position entirely determined by circumstances beyond her control? Even attempts to reconstruct her experiences from fragmentary evidence raise further uncertainties. Were observed behaviors evidence of adaptation, resistance, or internalized oppression? Each answer generates additional questions, creating an iterative cycle of inquiry and speculation that deepens the story's eerie resonance. Oral tradition complicates matters further. Accounts passed down through families and whispered across generations often include details that cannot be corroborated, yet they persist, coloring the understanding of her life. Some tales describe fleeting moments of courage or rebellion, suggesting that she was neither entirely passive nor entirely resigned. Others emphasize her suffering, reinforcing the narrative of endurance and oppression. The interplay of memory, imagination, and cultural transmission transforms her story into a living enigma, one in which fact and interpretation coalesce in a form that both illuminates and obscures reality. Ultimately, her life becomes a lens through which observers reflect on human nature, societal complicity, and the limitations of knowledge. The absence of definitive conclusions, the persistence of fragmentary evidence, and the weight of collective silence amplify the story's haunting quality. She exists simultaneously as a historical figure, a moral symbol, and an enduring puzzle, her experiences recorded in fragments, interpreted through multiple lenses, yet never fully comprehensible. This ambiguity contributes to the story's power, ensuring that it continues to evoke curiosity, dread, and reflection long after the events themselves have faded from immediate memory. Even the physical spaces she inhabited, the plantation, the corridors, the rooms where she lived, retain an air of mystery. Observers who visit these locations often comment on the palpable tension, the sense of surveillance and control lingering in the architecture, the furniture, and the arrangement of domestic space. These traces reinforce the psychological and historical resonance of her story, embedding memory within the environment itself. The past, in these spaces, is not merely recorded but sensed, experienced indirectly through atmosphere, observation, and imagination. Her story, therefore, remains unresolved in both literal and metaphorical senses. Scholars, storytellers, and casual observers alike confront the tension between evidence and imagination, history and myth, understanding and uncertainty. It is precisely this unresolved nature that perpetuates fascination. The young woman's life serves as an open-ended narrative, one in which human endurance, moral ambiguity, societal complicity, and psychological resilience converge in ways that defy complete comprehension. In this unresolved state, the story functions not only as historical record but as a reflection on the limits of knowledge, empathy, and moral engagement. The final resonance of her life is one of quiet, persistent unease. Even as time passes, her story lingers in collective memory, a shadow of endurance and oppression, of questions without answers, and of moral dilemmas unspoken. The audience, confronted with the fragments, the ambiguities, and the partial records, is left with a haunting impression, a young woman who endured beyond comprehension, a town that witnessed without intervention, and a legacy of silence that transforms history into an ongoing enigma. It is this unresolved tension, the interplay between lived reality, observation, and memory, that defines her life and ensures that, despite the passage of time, the story continues to resonate with all who attempt to understand it. The young woman's life, though largely obscured from official records and public acknowledgement, left a profound and lingering imprint on the town and its collective consciousness. Her endurance, suffering, and the silence surrounding her story became woven into the fabric of local culture, a subtle yet inescapable presence that influenced behavior, morality, and social memory for generations. The legacy of her existence was not marked by monuments or formal acknowledgement. Instead, it persisted through atmosphere, whispered recollections, and the invisible weight of moral contemplation. In this way, her life transcended personal experience to become an enduring cultural phenomenon, one in which memory, imagination, and historical interpretation intersected in a haunting tapestry. Those who remained in the town spoke of her cautiously, often framing references in terms of morality, endurance, or mysterious circumstance. Children were taught indirectly to respect the boundaries established by prior generations, absorbing lessons of compliance, obedience, and vigilance without ever understanding their origins. These teachings were subtle, encoded in ritual, repetition, and example rather than explicit instruction, yet their effect was pervasive. The young woman's life became a reference point, an invisible standard by which the morality, behavior, and attentiveness of future inhabitants were measured. Though her existence was shrouded in partial memory and rumor, the ethical weight of her experience endured, shaping norms and expectations across time. Her story also became a focal point for curiosity and speculation among scholars, storytellers, and later observers who sought to reconcile fragmented evidence with historical imagination. Diaries, letters, and oral histories were analyzed, cross-referenced, and interpreted, yielding both insight and frustration. The narrative's persistence highlighted the tension between what could be known and what could only be inferred. Scholars debated the plausibility of various accounts, weighed the influence of familial control, psychological strain, and social complicity, and attempted to reconstruct her experiences within the broader context of 19th-century society. Each attempt, though partial, underscored the enduring fascination with her life and the impossibility of fully disentangling fact from perception. The physical spaces she had inhabited further reinforced the eerie legacy of her existence. Visitors to the plantation and surrounding town often remarked upon the lingering sense of observation, the weight of history embedded in architecture, furniture, and the careful arrangement of rooms. Windows, corridors, and pathways were described as charged with the memory of surveillance, control, and endurance, a silent testament to the conditions under which her life had unfolded. These tangible traces, combined with the fragmented records and oral accounts, created a multidimensional legacy in which the environment itself became a vessel for memory, moral reflection, and haunting resonance. Within local folklore, the young woman's story acquired layers of symbolic meaning. Some narratives emphasized her endurance and resilience, portraying her as a figure who survived unimaginable pressure and psychological strain. Others highlighted the moral and ethical implications of her experience, framing her life as a cautionary tale about complicity, silence, and the human cost of social and familial control. These stories, passed down through generations, reflected both fascination and fear, simultaneously preserving her existence and obscuring the precise contours of reality. The blending of fact, speculation, and moral interpretation created a legacy that was both compelling and unsettling, leaving those who engaged with it with lingering questions and unease. Her influence extended beyond immediate geography and time. Writers, historians, and cultural commentators who later encountered fragments of her life were struck by the interplay between endurance and oppression, observation and isolation, reality and memory. Her story became a lens through which broader questions of human behavior, social hierarchy, and moral responsibility could be explored. Even without full documentation or clear understanding, the narrative resonated with universal themes of survival, complicity, and the tension between freedom and control. In this way, the young woman's life achieved a significance that surpassed the particulars of her circumstance, becoming emblematic of human experience under extreme social and psychological constraint. The moral and psychological complexity of her story continued to generate reflection and debate. Observers were confronted with the tension between admiration for her resilience and horror at the conditions imposed upon her. Ethical questions persisted. How much responsibility did those around her bear? What does it mean for a community to witness suffering yet remain silent? How are memory, moral consciousness, and social structure implicated in the perpetuation of oppression? These questions, unresolved and deeply unsettling, ensured that her story would continue to be examined, debated, and interpreted for generations. The young woman's life became a catalyst for ethical inquiry, her endurance a prism through which the interplay of human behavior and moral responsibility could be scrutinized. Even in contemporary interpretation, her legacy is framed by ambiguity and unresolved tension. Modern scholars and storytellers grapple with incomplete records, fragmented recollections, and the deliberate erasures imposed by social and familial structures. Attempts to reconstruct her experience are necessarily interpretive, shaped by historical context, psychological theory, and cultural analysis. Yet this ambiguity is itself a component of the legacy. It reinforces the sense of haunting, preserves the unresolved quality of her story, and highlights the enduring power of narrative to shape perception and memory even in the absence of complete knowledge. The unanswered questions surrounding her life become integral to its resonance, ensuring that fascination, speculation, and moral reflection persist indefinitely. The young woman's existence also functions as a reminder of the interplay between visibility and invisibility, presence and absence. Though observed and constrained during her life, she was later rendered invisible in public memory and formal records. Yet this very erasure amplifies the haunting quality of her story. The silence surrounding her, the gaps in historical record, and the partial nature of recollection compel continued engagement and inquiry. Her life demonstrates that the impact of an individual can endure not only through documentation or fame but through the moral and psychological imprint left upon communities, descendants, and collective memory. Ultimately, the eerie legacy of her life is both haunting and instructive. It challenges observers to confront the consequences of complicity, the fragility of autonomy under social and familial control, and the enduring impact of trauma and endurance. It evokes reflection on human behavior, societal structures, and the ways in which memory is preserved, distorted, and transmitted. The story's persistence, ambiguity, and moral resonance ensure that it continues to captivate, unsettle, and provoke thought, solidifying her place as both historical figure and cultural touchstone. Through all these layers, the fragmented records, the oral traditions, the architectural traces, the scholarly interpretations, and the moral reflections, the young woman's life remains a presence in the collective imagination. Her story is a testament to endurance, an emblem of oppression, and a continuing enigma whose resonance stretches far beyond the immediate confines of time and place. It is in this unresolved, lingering presence that the full weight of her legacy is felt, an eerie, compelling reminder that some stories endure not because they are fully known, but because they resist complete understanding, leaving behind echoes that haunt both memory and imagination.